In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And after certain wars, there is a man in a sealed chamber pressing a headset against his skull, listening to the last sounds a planet will ever make. 1 billion voices, then static, then nothing. Then he goes down to make sure it worked. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story belongs to Prentoch Savarre, Verification Auditor, 1st grade, attached to an Exterminatus fleet. The crew calls him the Gravedigger, which he says is inaccurate. A gravedigger implies there's something left to bury. 31 years, 19 worlds, 11,000 hours of terminal vox intercepts. He sleeps well. He eats his rations. He plays regicide in the evenings and lets the comptroller cheat because the man controls the sleeping pallets. He is, by his own account, well-adjusted. That's the part that should unsettle you. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. The last thing most people hear before dying is their own heartbeat. That wet, panicked drumming inside the chest, drowning out every other sound. But I can tell you something that most people will never know. Because most people only die once, and they die from the inside. I hear it from the outside. I hear entire worlds die. I sit in a metal chair bolted to the floor of a sealed listening chamber aboard a warship called the Wrathful Certitude. And I press my headset against my skull, and I listen to the last sounds a planet will ever make. The begging, the hymns, the static that follows when 1 billion voices stop at once. And then I go down there, to the surface, to make sure it worked. My name is Prentoch Savarre, and I hold the rank of Verification Auditor, 1st grade, attached to the Purification Fleet Solvent Kael under the seal of Inquisitor Helvane Croth of the Ordo Hereticus. That is my official designation. But the crew of this vessel, the engine seers and the ratings and the armsmen who drink their ration swill in the lower galleys, they have another name for what I do. They call me the Gravedigger, which is inaccurate because a gravedigger implies there is something left to bury. I have served aboard Exterminatus-capable vessels for 31 standard Terran years. I have personally overseen the post-action verification of 19 planetary extinction events. I have logged over 11,000 hours of terminal vox intercepts, which is a polite way of saying I have spent 11,000 hours listening to people die. And I want you to understand something important before we go any further. I am not telling you this because I am haunted. I am not a broken man clutching at the tattered remnants of his conscience. I sleep well. I eat my rations, all of them, and I enjoy the recaf they serve on Deck 14 because the servitor that brews it has a malfunction in its dispensing arm that always gives you a double measure. I play regicide in the evenings with Comptroller Belvane, who cheats, and I let him because he runs the supply manifests, and a man who controls the supply manifests controls the quality of your sleeping pallet. I am, by any reasonable standard, a well-adjusted individual doing a necessary job in service to the God Emperor of mankind. The fact that this job involves listening to the death screams of billions and then walking across the ashes to confirm they are, in fact, dead is simply a matter of professional specialization. Let me explain how this works, because I suspect most citizens of the Imperium have no real understanding of what an Exterminatus actually entails beyond the word itself. They hear it in sermons, in the whispered prayers of the ecclesiarchy, in the veiled threats of their local arbites precinct when tithe quotas are missed. Exterminatus, the ultimate sanction, the death of a world. It sounds clean when you say it like that. A single word sharp as a lass bolt, carrying the weight of divine judgment. And in a way it is clean. That is, after all, the entire point. You do not declare Exterminatus because you wish to conquer. You declare it because conquest is no longer worth the cost, because the rot has gone too deep, the corruption too far, the Xenos infestation too thorough. You declare it because the Imperium has decided, through the authority vested in its most powerful servants, that this particular world is worth more as a corpse than as a patient. And then someone has to check the corpse. That is where I come in. Or rather, that is where I come in at the end. My role is bifurcated, which is a word I learned from a Magos biologist who served aboard this vessel before he was reassigned to a research station in the Ultima Segmentum. Bifurcated, split into two halves. The first half of my duties begins before the killing, or rather, during it. I am the Vox Interceptor. When the Exterminatus order is given and the weapons are deployed, whether that means virus bombs, cyclonic torpedoes, atmospheric incinerators, or the sustained fury of lance batteries fired until the gun crews collapse from exhaustion, there is a window. A brief window, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, depending on the method, where the planet below is still broadcasting. The Vox networks, the astropathic relays, the civilian hailing frequencies, the military command channels, the emergency bands that every world maintains and almost nobody tests until the day they are needed, and by then it is far too late. All of those signals pour upward through the atmosphere like blood from a wound, and I am the one who catches them. I sit in my chamber. I have 6 dedicated Vox receivers, each one tuned to a different band of the electromagnetic spectrum, each one feeding into a central cogitator that timestamps and catalogs every intercept. The Inquisitor requires a full record. This is not optional. This is not a courtesy. The Ordo Hereticus maintains detailed archives of every Exterminatus action carried out under its seal, and those archives include the terminal transmissions of the condemned world. Officially, the purpose is intelligence. You would be surprised what a dying governor will confess in his last minutes when he believes no one important is listening. You would be surprised what military commanders will broadcast in the clear when their encryption cogitators are melting. There is a wealth of data in those final moments. Data about troop dispositions on neighboring worlds, about supply lines, about hidden caches of Immaterium, about the locations of other heretics who may have escaped the net. That is the official purpose, intelligence gathering. But I will tell you the unofficial purpose, and it is much simpler. It is proof. Proof that the world died. Proof that the Emperor's judgment was carried out in full and without mercy. An Inquisitor who orders an Exterminatus must justify that order, if not now, then eventually, when the bureaucratic machinery of the Imperium catches up with the expenditure of resources. And nothing justifies an Exterminatus quite like the recorded screams of the condemned. Nothing shuts down a review board faster than playing them the last 30 seconds of a planetary governor begging for forgiveness while the atmosphere outside his bunker burns. I have seen senior administratum officials, men and women who have spent their entire careers reviewing expenditure reports and signing death warrants with the same hand. I have seen them flinch when I play those recordings. It ends the conversation. It makes the paperwork disappear. It reminds everyone in the room that this was not a waste of Imperial resources. This was justice. And then there is the second half, the verification. After the weapons have done their work, after the fires have burned and the oceans have boiled, and the atmosphere has been stripped or poisoned or incinerated, depending on the methodology employed, someone has to go down there. Someone has to take a shuttle through whatever remains of the upper atmosphere, land on whatever remains of the surface, step out in full environmental gear, and confirm with their own eyes and their own instruments that the planet is dead. Not mostly dead, not dead except for a few stubborn microorganisms clinging to life in some deep thermal vent. Dead, completely, utterly, irrevocably dead, because the Imperium does not do things halfway, and because the things that necessitate an Exterminatus, the Chaos cults, the genes-stealer infestations, the warp-tainted abominations, these things have a terrible habit of surviving conditions that should be unsurvivable. A single spore, a single cell, a single demon-touched fragment of bone buried under a kilometer of fused glass. That is all it takes. One survivor, and the entire action, the death of a world and everyone on it, becomes meaningless. So I go down. I take my sampling kit, my auspex, my atmospheric analyzers, my biodetection suite, and I walk the surface of a dead world. I collect soil samples and air samples and radiation readings. I check for biological activity at the molecular level. I scan for warp signatures. I take pict captures of the terrain from multiple angles and feed them into the cogitator for comparison against pre-Exterminatus orbital surveys. And then I write my report. Prentoch Savarre, Verification Auditor, first grade, hereby certifies that planetary body designation such and such, formerly known as whatever it was called when people lived there, has been rendered fully sterile in accordance with Exterminatus protocol, and presents no further biological, psychic, or strategic threat to the Imperium of man. Signed, sealed, filed. Done. The whole process, from the first intercepted scream to the last signed document, usually takes about 3 standard Terran days. 3 days to kill a world and make sure it stays killed. I have done it 19 times. The 20th is coming soon. Inquisitor Croth has been reviewing the intelligence dossiers for a world called Wrathful Certitude in the Korath subsector, and from what I have overheard in the briefing chambers, the situation there is well beyond salvation. Genes stealer infestation, 4th generation at minimum, possibly 5th. The planetary government is compromised. The PDF is compromised. The ecclesiarchy is compromised. Even the Arbitesi precinct has gone dark. When a world reaches that stage, there is only one prescription. I have already begun calibrating my Vox receivers. I have already cleaned my environmental suit and charged the power cells on my sampling equipment. I have already reserved my berth on the verification shuttle. These are the habits of a professional. But you asked me about the horror of it, did you not? Let me tell you about horror. Horror is a luxury. Horror is what you feel when your circumstances permit you the indulgence of moral reflection. A man drowning does not feel horror. He feels water in his lungs. I do not feel horror. I feel the weight of my headset against my ears. I feel the cold of a dead world's surface through the soles of my boots. I feel the ache in my lower back from sitting in the same chair for 9 hours straight, listening to a civilization end. These are physical sensations. They are manageable. My colleagues find this attitude unsettling. Comptroller Belvane once asked me, over a regicide board, whether I ever dreamed about the worlds I had verified, whether the screams followed me into sleep. I told him the truth. I dream about the same things everyone dreams about. Falling, being late, sometimes food, which is the most common dream aboard a warship, because the food is always terrible, and the subconscious compensates. I have never once dreamed about a dead world. The dead worlds are empty. That is the entire point. Emptiness does not haunt you. I am aware that this makes me sound monstrous, but every world I have verified was condemned by an Inquisitor of the God Emperor's Holy Ordos. Not by me. I do not choose which worlds die. My role is clerical. I am the man who checks the work after it is done. I am, at worst, a footnote in a very long book of death, and I am comfortable with that. Let me tell you about my first one, Prentoch Minoris, Agri World. Or it had been an Agri World once, before the cult took root. Segmentum obscurus, trailing edge, so far from the Astronomicon that the navigators had to squint. I was 22 standard, fresh out of the administratum clerical pools on Veridheim, where I had spent 3 years filing tithe assessments for grain shipments that I never saw and could not have identified if you put them in front of me. I had been requisitioned. That is the word they used, not recruited, not selected. Requisitioned like a crate of ammunition or a replacement cogitator part. The Inquisition needed bodies with certain qualifications. I could read. I could write. I could operate a vox set. I had a security clearance, albeit a low one, on account of my father having served in the Departamento Munitorum for 16 years without once being accused of heresy, which by Imperial standards made my bloodline practically saintly. And so the paperwork was filed, and my name was added to a manifest, and 3 weeks later I was standing in the observation deck of a lunar-class cruiser, watching a planet turn colors that planets should not turn. Prentoch Minoris had been a quiet world, 60 million souls, give or take. Mostly agri workers, the standard population of the standard Imperial breadbasket, toiling under toxic skies and chemical rain to grow crops they were not permitted to eat, shipping their output up the tithe chain to feed hive worlds they would never visit. The kind of world that the Immaterium depends upon absolutely and rewards not at all. I mention this not because I felt sorry for them. I mention it because it is relevant to understanding why the cult spread so quickly. When your entire existence consists of back-breaking labor, nutrient paste, and the distant promise of a heaven you will never see, the man who whispers that there are other gods listening, closer gods, hungry gods who will give you power in exchange for devotion, that man does not need to be very persuasive. He just needs to be there. The cult on Prentoch Minoris was chaos. Nurgle, specifically, though I did not know the differences between the ruinous powers at the time. I learned them later. You learn them on a vessel like this, the same way you learn the names of diseases, not out of fascination, but out of professional necessity. The infection had been spreading for decades, 3 generations at least. By the time the Ordo Hereticus became aware of it, the taint had reached the planetary governor's household, the ecclesiarchy leadership, and roughly 40% of the general population. The remaining 60% were either too sick to resist, too afraid to speak, or too deeply embedded in the cult's infrastructure to be extracted without unraveling the entire social fabric of the world. Inquisitor Croth, who was younger then, sharper, more inclined to dramatic pronouncements and less inclined to the quiet ruthlessness she has since perfected, declared the world lost. The order was given. Virus bombs. I did not know what a virus bomb was. I had read the words in training materials, the same way you read about orbital lance strikes, or warp storms, or the black ships, as abstractions, as entries in a lexicon of imperial power that existed in theory, but surely never in your immediate vicinity. And then I was handed a headset and told to sit in a chair and listen. My supervisor at the time was a man named Korostag Plein, who had been doing this job for 11 years and who had the emotional range of a blast door. He showed me how to calibrate the Vox receivers, how to timestamp the intercepts, how to tag transmissions by category, military, civilian, ecclesiarchy, emergency, unknown, and how to maintain a running log in the cogitator. He did all of this with the same flat instructional tone that my tutors on Veridheim had used when teaching me how to file grain assessments. Here is the machine. Here is how you operate it. Here is what you will hear. Do not react. The last instruction was unnecessary. I did not react because I did not understand what I was hearing. Not at first. The Life-Eater virus, when deployed via atmospheric dispersal from high-yield warheads, does its work with a speed that is almost elegant. Almost. The warheads detonate in the upper atmosphere, seeding the viral payload across the jet streams, and within minutes the pathogen has reached the surface. It devours organic matter at the cellular level, everything biological, every plant, every animal, every human being, every bacterium, every microscopic organism in the soil and the water and the air is reduced to a slurry of organic compounds. The process generates enormous quantities of flammable gas, methane, and others, which accumulate in the lower atmosphere until a single ignition source, usually a follow-up lance strike from orbit, transforms the entire planet into a firestorm that burns away everything that the virus did not already destroy. What I heard through my headset in those first minutes was confusion. Prentoch Minoris did not know what was happening. The military Vox channels lit up with reports of something in the air, something that was dissolving equipment, something that was eating through sealed doors and rebreather masks, and the blessed ceramite of Arbites riot armor. Civilian channels were worse, static-laced fragments of screaming, half-formed words, the sound of wet collapse as the virus reached the broadcasting stations and dissolved the operators mid-sentence. One channel, I remember this very clearly, was a local ecclesiarchy frequency, and the voice on it was a preacher, a man who had presumably spent his entire life praising the emperor from a pulpit, and he was reciting the litany of protection, that old prayer from the uplifting primer that soldiers mutter before battle and civilians whisper during storms, and his voice was steady, so steady right up until the moment it was not. There was a sound, a wet, heavy sound, like cloth tearing underwater, and then there was nothing, not silence, nothing. The carrier signal was still active, still broadcasting, but there was no voice on it anymore because there was no mouth to speak with and no lungs to push the air and no brain to form the words. The signal ran for another 40 seconds before the equipment itself dissolved. That was the first time I understood what I had been hired to do. Korostag Plein, my supervisor, watched my face throughout the entire event. He told me later that he was assessing whether I would need to be replaced. Some people, he said, broke during their first intercept. They screamed. They pulled the headset off. One man, years before my time, had tried to broadcast a warning to the planet below, as if a single voice from a warship could somehow countermand an inquisitorial order and stop the virus that was already eating its way through the biosphere. That man was executed, not for treason, technically, but for breach of operational security, which in the context of the Inquisition amounts to the same thing. Korostag wanted to know whether I was going to be a problem. I was not. I sat in my chair. I listened. I logged the intercepts. I noted the timestamps. I categorized the transmissions. Military, civilian, ecclesiarchy, emergency. Unknown. When it was over, when the last signal had died and the firestorm had consumed the atmosphere and the planet below was a blackened, smoking husk visible through the observation ports as a dull orange smear against the void. I removed my headset, stood up, filed my report, and went to the mess hall for evening rations. The meal was a protein block with synthetic gravy and a cup of lukewarm recaf. I ate all of it. Korostag told me I would do well in this line of work. The verification of Prentoch Minoris came 2 days later, after the surface had cooled enough for a shuttle to make atmospheric entry without immediate structural failure. I was not the primary verifier for that one. I was an assistant, a junior auditor carrying the sampling equipment and learning the protocols by observation. The primary verifier was a woman named Lethe Osk, who had done this 9 times before, and who moved across the surface of the dead world with the casual efficiency of someone walking through a warehouse checking inventory. She taught me how to take soil cores, how to seal the sample vials against cross-contamination, how to read the biodetection suite and interpret the results, how to recognize the difference between residual chemical activity, which was expected and normal in the aftermath of a virus bombing, and actual biological processes, which would indicate a failure of sterilization and trigger an immediate secondary strike. Prentoch Minoris was dead, thoroughly, comprehensively dead. The surface was a plain of fused glass and calcite ash, stretching to the horizon in every direction, broken only by the skeletal remains of structures that had been too large or too dense to fully combust. The atmosphere was a thin haze of particulate matter, not breathable, not survivable, but not immediately lethal through the sealed suit. The temperature at ground level was still elevated, somewhere around 70 degrees Celsius in the shade, though there was no shade because there was nothing tall enough left standing to cast a shadow. The silence was the most striking thing. Not the absence of human voices, which I had already experienced through the headset, but the absence of everything. No wind because the atmospheric currents had been disrupted by the firestorm. No animal calls, obviously. No insect drone. No mechanical hum from generators or factories or vehicles. No electromagnetic interference from active power grids. Nothing. A silence so total that I could hear the servos in my environmental suit adjusting to my movements, the click of my boot soles against the fused ground, the sound of my own breathing inside the helmet, amplified and close and impossibly loud in a world where nothing else made a sound. Lethe Osk told me that I would get used to it. She was right. I assisted on 3 more verifications before Korostug Pline died. Not heroically, not in service. He had a cardiac event during a standard sleep cycle and was found in his berth the next morning, cold, with his boots still on because Korostug always slept with his boots on, a habit he had acquired during his early years in the Navy when emergency actions could pull you from your rack at any hour. I inherited his chair, his headset, and his position as primary vox interceptor aboard the Wrathful Certitude. I was 26. By the standards of the Inquisition, practically an infant. By the standards of anyone who listened to worlds die for a living, considerably older. Lethe Osk continued as primary verifier for another 4 years before she was transferred. Not because she wanted to go, but because Inquisitor Croth requested a verifier with specialization in Xenos-related contamination, and Lethe's expertise was strictly limited to chaos-tainted environments. Her replacement was a thin, nervous man named Grottvile Basque, who had theoretical qualifications from some scholar on a world I had never heard of, and no practical experience whatsoever. He lasted 2 verifications before requesting a transfer to any other posting, citing medical grounds that were almost certainly fabricated, but which the ship's chirurgeon endorsed because, and I am speculating here, the chirurgeon was tired of treating Grottvile's anxiety-related digestive issues. After Grottvile came another replacement, and after that one came another, and eventually, as these things tend to happen in the Imperium when no one else wants the job, I was given the role myself. Primary Vox Interceptor and Primary Verification Auditor combined into a single posting because the Inquisition is always looking for ways to reduce headcount without reducing capability, and I had demonstrated that I was capable of doing both jobs without complaint. That was 23 years ago. I have not complained since. Let me tell you about the sounds, because that is what people find most fascinating when they learn what I do. Not the verification, not the walking across dead landscapes and collecting dirt samples like some deranged botanist cataloging an empty garden. The sounds, the intercepts, the last words of the condemned. People want to know what a dying world sounds like, as if there is a single answer, as if every planet screams the same way a human screams when you step on their foot. They do not. Every world dies differently. Every world has its own voice, its own character, its own particular flavor of desperation, and after 31 years of listening, I can tell you that no two extinctions sound alike, the same way no two storms sound alike, even though they are all just wind and water. Prentoch Minoris, my first, sounded wet. That is the word I come back to whenever I think about it. Wet. The virus did its work so fast that the transmissions were interrupted not by silence, but by dissolution. Voices did not trail off into nothing. They collapsed like structures losing their foundations, sagging inward and then gone. The last clear transmission I logged was a PDF command channel, a kernel whose name I never learned, broadcasting a situation report to a command structure that no longer existed, reciting grid coordinates and unit designations with the mechanical precision of a man who had been trained to give reports and was going to give this one, even if it was the last thing he did. It was. Kalunvor, my third, was different. Kalunvor was a fortress world in the Segmentum Tempestus, a planet that had been fortified against external threats for 6 centuries and which had never once considered the possibility that the threat might come from within. The cult there was Tzinch, sorcerers. They had infiltrated the officer corps of the Planetary Defense Force and were using the fortress network itself as a focusing array for some manner of warp ritual that our astropaths detected from 3 systems away. Inquisitor Croth ordered cyclonic torpedoes for that one. No virus, no patience. Cyclonic torpedoes are blunt instruments, massive warheads that detonate with enough force to crack a planet's crust and destabilize its core. There is no gradual dying with a cyclonic strike. One moment there is a world with continents and oceans and an atmosphere and 14 million people living inside reinforced bunkers that they believed could withstand anything. The next moment there is an expanding cloud of debris and a gravitational anomaly where the planet used to be. The intercepts from Kalunvor were short, 38 seconds from the first detonation to total signal loss. In those 38 seconds, I captured exactly 4 transmissions. The first was an automated defense alert from the orbital monitoring station, which detected the incoming torpedoes and classified them as friendly ordnance, because the Imperium's own weapons do not register as hostile on Imperial detection systems, which is either a design flaw or a philosophical statement, depending on your perspective. The second was a burst transmission from the Fortress Command Bunker, a single word repeated 3 times in increasing volume. The word was confirm. They were asking someone, anyone, to confirm that this was a mistake. No one confirmed. The third was a civilian emergency frequency, just static and a sound that might have been a child or might have been feedback from a damaged transmitter. I logged it as unknown. The fourth was silence. Not the silence of an empty channel, but the silence of a channel that had been broadcasting and then ceased to exist. There is a difference. An empty channel has a flat, clean quality, like a blank sheet of paper. A dead channel has texture. There is a moment barely perceptible where the signal does not fade but is torn away, ripped from the carrier wave like a page being pulled from a book. And then nothing. I verified Kalunvor from orbit because there was no surface left to walk on. Morrisvane Reach was my 7th, and it is the one I describe to people when they want to understand what a slow death sounds like. Morrisvane Reach was a mining world, a hollow shell of a planet riddled with tunnels and excavation shafts that went down to the mantle. The population was 200 million, most of them subterranean, living and working in the deep warrens where the ore was extracted. The contamination was biological, not chaos for once. Tyrannide. A gene-stealer patriarch had established itself in the deepest levels of the primary mining complex, and by the time the brood was discovered, 3/4 of the population carried the gene's stealer taint. The Inquisitor assigned to that operation not Croth, but a colleague of hers named Verimundus Troll, who had requisitioned our fleet for Xenos-rated verification capacity. A man who spoke very quietly and smiled too much, and frightened me more than any screaming zealot ever could. Inquisitor Troll chose atmospheric incinerator torpedoes. This is the method you use when you want to kill everything on the surface and in the upper crust, but leave the deep geology intact, usually because there are mineral resources worth preserving for future exploitation. The torpedoes ignite the atmosphere, creating a firestorm that sears the surface clean and pushes killing temperatures deep into any tunnel system connected to the surface by ventilation shafts or access points. The problem with Morrisvane Reach was that the mining tunnels went deep, very deep, and the gene's stealer cult, with the cunning that is typical of their kind, had sealed many of the deeper access points with blast doors, rated to withstand exactly the kind of thermal event that was being inflicted upon them, which meant that the firestorm killed the surface population almost instantly, but left the deep tunnel populations alive, trapped in their sealed warrens, cut off from the surface, with no ventilation, diminishing oxygen, and the certain knowledge that no rescue was coming. The intercepts from Morrisvane Reach lasted 11 days. 11 days. I sat in my chair, and I listened to 200,000 people slowly suffocate in the dark. The military channels went quiet first, within hours, as the PDF command structure, what was left of it, recognized the situation and either died by their own hand or simply stopped broadcasting. The civilian channels lasted longer, much longer. I heard families. I heard children asking questions that their parents could not answer. I heard engineers attempting to calculate oxygen reserves. And I heard the moment when the calculations were completed and the results were shared. And the silence that followed was not the silence of death, but the silence of understanding. I heard prayer circles, groups of voices reciting litanies to the Emperor in the dark, their words growing slower and more slurred as the carbon dioxide levels rose and their brains began to shut down. I heard a man singing, just one man alone on a frequency that no one else was using, singing a song I did not recognize in a dialect I could not place, singing it over and over, each repetition a little softer, a little slower, until the song simply stopped and the channel went to static. I logged all of it. 11 days of intercepts, 416 hours of recordings categorized and time-stamped and filed in the archives of the Ordo Hereticus. My report for that operation was the longest I have ever written, 47 pages. Inquisitor Troll read it in its entirety, smiled, and told me it was thorough. I still do not know what he meant by that. The verification of Morrisvane Reach required a surface descent, which was unusual for a world that had been atmospherically incinerated. But the Inquisitor wanted confirmation that the deep tunnels were dead. I descended with a team of 4, 3 gun servitors and a tech adept, whose name I have deliberately forgotten because she was unpleasant, and because she spent the entire descent complaining about the calibration of the Auspex array, which she insisted was reading false positives. It was not reading false positives. The tunnels were dead. Everything in them was dead. but the residual heat from 200,000 decomposing bodies in a sealed, unventilated environment had created thermal signatures that mimicked biological activity on the auspex. I knew this because I had heard those bodies stop breathing over the course of 11 days. The tech adept did not have that context. She only had her instruments, and her instruments were telling her that something down there might still be alive, and she wanted to leave immediately before whatever it was found us. I told her it was decomposition. She did not believe me. I played her 30 seconds of the final intercept, the one with the singing man, and she believed me after that. She did not speak for the remainder of the mission. There was one other thing about Morris Vane Reach that I noted in my log, but did not include in the final report because it did not meet the threshold for actionable intelligence. My psi-meter, the standard issue warp detection instrument that I carry on every verification descent, registered a reading that was slightly above baseline. Not significantly. Not enough to flag as a warp anomaly or trigger a secondary assessment. Just a tick above the expected residual levels for a world whose population had died in sustained psychic distress over the course of 11 days. I attributed it to exactly that. The lingering emotional residue of prolonged mass death, which is known to produce elevated psi-meter readings for weeks or months after the event. I noted it, I dismissed it, and I moved on. I mention Morris Vane Reach because it is the operation that most people would point to as the one that should have broken me. 11 days, 416 hours, the singing man, the children, the slow, inevitable, gasping end of 200,000 souls sealed in the dark like insects in a jar. That should have been the one. That should have been the moment when Prentoch Savarre looked at his headset and his chair and his sampling kit and said, "No more. I cannot do this. I am finished." But it was not, because here is the thing about Morris Vane Reach that I understood then and still understand now. Those people were dead the moment the Inquisitor signed the order. Not when the torpedoes launched, not when the atmosphere ignited. Not when the blast doors sealed and the oxygen began to thin. They were dead the moment the decision was made. Everything after that was just timing. The 11 days, the slow suffocation, the singing. All of it was timing. The Imperium had already killed them. The universe was just catching up with the paperwork. And my job, as always, was to make sure the paperwork was correct. I took my soil samples. I filed my report. I went to the mess hall and ate my rations. The protein block was dry and the recaf was cold, and Comptroller Belvain beat me at regicide that evening because I was distracted, which I attributed to fatigue rather than moral injury, because it was fatigue. 11 days in a listening chair will do that to your spine. Santhiel was my 12th. Now that was an interesting one. Santhiel was a civilized world, which is the administratum's way of saying it had cities and infrastructure and a population large enough to be counted in the billions rather than the millions. 4 billion, roughly. A world with theaters and universities and a functioning judicial system and an ecclesiarchy presence that was, by all accounts, devout and orthodox and entirely loyal to the Imperium. And it was condemned, not for chaos, not for Xenos, but for defiance. The planetary governor of Santhiel, a man named Aldrin Vorsche, had refused a tithe increase. Not the tithe itself, the increase. The existing tithe was being paid on time and in full, but the Departamento Munitorum had calculated that Santhiel's industrial output could support a 30% increase in material contribution, and Governor Vorsche had declined, citing the strain on his world's infrastructure and the welfare of his population, as if the welfare of a single world's population were a factor worthy of consideration in the grand calculus of imperial logistics. He was given 3 standard years to comply. He did not. Negotiations were attempted, threats were delivered, Sanctions were imposed. Governor Vorsche held firm. The official charge was defiance of the imperial tithe. The unofficial reason, as I came to understand much later, through the whisper networks of senior staff who drink too much amasec during warp transit, had more to do with what Vorsche had uncovered about certain tithe shipments that were being diverted before reaching their stated destinations, diversions that benefited individuals considerably more powerful than a planetary governor. Vorsche was, by all accounts, a principled man. Principled men who discover inconvenient truths about powerful people tend not to live long in the Imperium. Inquisitor Croth was not the one who condemned Santhiel. That order came from higher up, from an Inquisitor Lord whose name I was not cleared to know, and whose seal I saw only once, on the execution order itself, pressed into black wax and still warm. Croth carried out the sentence because her fleet was the closest asset. She chose lance bombardment for Santhiel. No virus, no torpedoes, just the sustained fire of the Wrathful Certitude's lance batteries and the 2 escort frigates that accompanied us, pouring focused energy into the planet's surface for 14 hours until the crust fractured and the oceans boiled and the atmosphere was stripped away by the thermal bloom. The intercepts from Santhiel were the worst I have ever recorded, and I say that with full awareness of what I heard from Morris Vane Reach. Because the people of Santhiel were not cultists, they were not Xenos tainted, they were not screaming for dark gods or begging for the mercy of entities that had no mercy to give. They were loyal. They were Imperial citizens who had committed no crime except living on a world whose governor had the audacity to negotiate. And they knew it. That was the worst part. They knew. The military channels broadcast surrender codes within the first hour. The ecclesiarchy frequency carried a continuous loop of the Imperial Oath of Allegiance, played at maximum broadcast power, as if the sound of 10,000 voices swearing loyalty to the Emperor might somehow reach the weapons batteries in orbit and convince them to stop firing. Civilian channels carried pleas that were not addressed to any human authority, but directly to the God Emperor himself, as if he might intervene, as if he might reach down from the golden throne and catch the last bolts in his divine hand and say, "No, not these ones are mine." He did not. I logged it all. Every surrender, every oath, every prayer, every scream. 14 hours, and when it was done, I went down to the surface and I took my samples and the world was dead, and I wrote my report and I signed it and I filed it. During the verification, my psi-meter gave me another elevated reading, higher than Morris Vane, noticeably higher. I stood in the ruins of what had been a cathedral district, the devotional heart of a world that had prayed loyally to the Emperor until the very last second. And the needle climbed to a level I had never seen outside of a confirmed warp incursion site. I ran the calibration check twice. The instrument was functioning correctly. I noted the reading in my log. I did not flag it because I could rationalize it. 4 billion faithful souls dying in a state of fervent prayer, directed toward the Emperor with an intensity born of pure desperation. Of course, the psychic residue would be elevated. Of course, the warp would remember that. I wrote it off as a statistical outlier produced by unusual circumstances. In hindsight, the unusual circumstance was that I was standing on the second data point of a pattern I was not yet ready to see. There was something else about Santhiel that I noticed, though at the time I filed it under the same mental category as the psi-meter reading, which is to say, I filed it under things that are not my concern. Inquisitor Croth had not ordered Santhiel. The order came from above her. But I observed her on the command deck during the bombardment, through the observation gallery where I sometimes go to stretch my legs between intercept sessions, and her expression was not what I expected. I expected solemnity. I expected the grim resolve of a woman carrying out an order she had not chosen but would execute faithfully. What I saw instead was attention. Focus. The look of a woman watching something she had been waiting for. It lasted only a moment, and then her face returned to its usual mask of disciplined blankness. And I told myself I had imagined it because the alternative was that Inquisitor Croth found something satisfying about the death of a loyal world, and that was a thought I was not equipped to think. Not then. And the protein block at dinner that evening was slightly better than usual because the supply ship had arrived while we were in orbit and fresh stocks had been loaded. Small mercies. Governor Vorsh's last transmission was on a private frequency, encrypted, but our cogitators broke the cipher in seconds because it was a civilian-grade encryption meant for commercial communications, not military security. He was talking to his daughter. She was on an orbital station above the planet, one of the commercial platforms that had been evacuated before the bombardment began. She was safe. She was going to live. And he was telling her that he was sorry not for what he had done, but for what was going to happen to her, because the daughter of a condemned governor does not lead an easy life in the Imperium, and he wanted her to know that he had done what he believed was right, and that he hoped she would understand someday, even if no one else did. The transmission ended mid-sentence. Not because the encryption failed or the equipment was destroyed. He simply stopped talking. I believe he ran out of things to say. I did not include that intercept in my official report. It was personal communication, not relevant to the intelligence assessment. That is what I told myself. That is still what I tell myself. The fact that it was the only intercept I have ever omitted from a report is not something I think about often, and when I do think about it, I remind myself that the omission was procedurally justified and leave it at that. Life aboard the Wrathful Certitude is, in most respects, indistinguishable from life aboard any Imperial warship. The vessel is a Retribution-class battleship, approximately 4 kilometers long, with a crew of somewhere between 40 and 50,000, depending on how recently the press gangs have been active. It is old. The commissioning plaque on the bridge level reads M37, which makes the ship roughly 3,000 years old, though individual components have been replaced and repaired so many times that the question of whether it is the same ship is more philosophical than structural. The crew does not, for the most part, know the details of what we do. They know they serve aboard an inquisitorial vessel. They know the ship carries weapons that other ships do not. They know that sometimes the vessel enters orbit above a world and fires for a very long time, and then the world is not there anymore. But the specifics, the why, and the how, and the what comes after, these are compartmented. The ratings know only their duties. The officers know what they need to know. The senior staff knows what the Inquisitor permits them to know. And the Inquisitor knows everything, or at least believes she does, which in practical terms amounts to the same thing. I occupy an unusual position in this hierarchy. My rank is technically civilian, which places me outside the military chain of command. I do not take orders from the ship's captain, a perpetually exhausted man named Holoric Vrace, who has commanded the Wrathful Certitude for 19 years and who looks, quite frankly, like he has not slept for any of them. I do not answer to the first officer or the weapons master or the chief engineer. I answer to Inquisitor Croth directly, and through her to the Ordo Hereticus, and through them to the Emperor himself, though I suspect the Emperor has more pressing concerns than the filing habits of a mid-grade Verification Auditor. This direct line of authority means that I am treated with a peculiar mixture of deference and suspicion by the rest of the crew. The officers are polite to me because they do not know what I might report to the Inquisitor. The ratings avoid me because they have been told by the petty officers who control their miserable little lives that I am the man who listens to the dead, and on a warship full of superstitious void-born souls who believe that speaking a man's name after death will summon his ghost, this makes me something to be feared. I find this useful. It means I am never disturbed during meals. The exception, as I have mentioned, is Comptroller Belvane. Edrith Belvane, to give him his full name, though no one uses it because Edrith is a name that invites ridicule, and Belvane has spent considerable effort cultivating an image of quiet menace that does not pair well with a name that sounds like a sneeze. Belvane runs the ship's supply logistics, which means he controls everything from food quality to sleeping assignments to the distribution of personal items purchased from the ship's stores. He is, in the petty economy of warship life, one of the most powerful men aboard, and he knows it. And he uses it with the kind of casual cruelty that powerful men employ when they want to remind you that they could make your life worse, but have chosen, for the moment, not to. He cheats at regicide. He always has. He moves pieces when he thinks I am not looking, or he claims rules that do not exist, or he simply declares victory in situations where the board clearly favors my position. I let him do this because, as I have said, he controls the supply manifests, and because regicide is boring when played honestly and considerably more entertaining when played against a man who cheats with conviction. Belvane is the closest thing I have to a friend aboard this vessel, which tells you everything you need to know about my social life. There are others, of course. The Inquisitor's retinue includes roughly 30 individuals of various specializations. There is a small detachment of inquisitorial stormtroopers, who occasionally accompany me on verification descents when the threat assessment warrants armed escort. Though they dislike this duty because it means spending hours on a dead world where there is nothing to shoot. There is the ship's chirurgeon, a woman named Felstow Brecht, who once, during a routine medical examination, asked me whether I experienced any psychological disturbance as a result of my work. I told her no. She made a note in my file and moved on. And there is Hammond Trevik. I need to tell you about Hammond Trevik, because what happened with Trevik is important to understanding what came later. Trevik was a junior auditor assigned to my section 8 years ago, fresh from the Schola, full of theory and the particular brand of fervent loyalty that the Imperium cultivates in its young. He was 20 standard, clean-shaven, spoke with a clipped Mordian accent, and he believed, with the absolute certainty of youth, that our work was holy, not just necessary, holy. He believed that the Exterminatus was the Emperor's own judgment made manifest, that the dead worlds we walked were sacred ground, cleansed by divine fire. He was competent, his reports were accurate, his verification protocols were followed to the letter. He simply believed in the job more than the job required, which is not a crime but is, in my experience, a vulnerability. The operation that changed Trevik was Grothmund Primus. That was my 15th, his 3rd. Grothmund Primus was an industrial world, a minor forge adjunct that supplied components to a nearby forge world whose name I was not cleared to know. The population was 2 billion. The contamination was chaos, as it usually is. A cult of corn had risen in the manufactorum districts, spreading through the labor force like fire through dry tinder, converting workers into blood-crazed fanatics who had begun dismantling the production lines and building crude weapons and altars from the repurposed machinery. By the time we arrived, the cult controlled 70% of the planet's surface, and the remaining loyalist population had retreated to a chain of fortified hab-blocks in the northern hemisphere, where they were holding out against daily assaults with diminishing ammunition and diminishing hope. Inquisitor Croth chose a combined method for Grothmund Primus. Virus bombs for the equatorial and southern regions where the cult was strongest, followed by atmospheric incinerator torpedoes for the northern hemisphere to ensure complete sterilization, including the loyalist holdouts. This is not unusual. The loyalists on a condemned world are condemned along with everyone else. There is no extraction. There is no rescue. The Exterminatus order does not distinguish between guilty and innocent, between the cultist and the citizen who fought against the cult until the very last moment. The world is lost. Everyone on it is lost. That is the definition. Trevik did not take this well, not immediately. He performed his duties during the intercept phase with his usual precision. He logged the transmissions, categorized them, time-stamped them. But I noticed during the hours when the northern frequencies were active and the Loyalists were broadcasting that Trevik's hands were shaking. The Loyalists knew what was coming. They had been told, presumably by someone in their chain of command, who had intercepted the fleet communications. Or perhaps they simply recognized the configuration of warships in orbit, the torpedo tubes opening, the lance batteries charging. They knew, and they did not beg, they did not plead. They broadcast a final message, a formal statement of loyalty to the Imperium, read by their commanding officer in a voice that did not waver, affirming their faith in the Emperor and their acceptance of his judgment, and asking only that their names be recorded in the archives of the Imperium so that their sacrifice would be remembered. I logged the message. I tagged it. Military priority for archival review. I did my job. Trevik did his job. And then the torpedoes fell and the atmosphere burned and the frequencies went dead. And Trevik removed his headset and placed it on the console and stood up and left the listening chamber without a word. He did not come to the mess hall that evening. He did not appear for duty the following morning. He was found in the Engineerium on the lower decks, sitting on the floor between two coolant pipes, staring at nothing, whispering the names of the dead. Not the names from the intercepts, the names of the Loyalists who had broadcast their final message. He had memorized them, all of them, every name in the list, and he was reciting them like a prayer, over and over, as if repetition could give them the remembrance they had asked for. The ship's chirurgeon diagnosed acute psychological collapse. Trevik was sedated, confined to the Medici ward, and transferred off the vessel at the next port of call. I do not know what happened to him after that. The Inquisition does not maintain forwarding addresses for broken assets. He was replaced eventually by a servitor, which tells you everything about how the Inquisition views the relative reliability of humans versus machines in positions requiring emotional detachment. I mentioned Trevik because of what he said to me in the listening chamber in the minutes before he walked out. Not the question everyone asks, though he asked that too. The other thing. The thing I dismissed. He had been staring at the console, at the dead frequencies, at the flat lines where the Loyalist signals had been, and without looking at me, he said very quietly that the screaming had not stopped. I told him the frequencies were dead. I could see the flat lines on the display. There was nothing broadcasting from Grothmund Primus. Nothing at all. The signals had terminated. The planet was silent. Trevik shook his head. He said he knew the frequencies were dead. He said the screaming was not coming through the headset. He said it was coming from somewhere else, somewhere behind the sound, and that it had started during the intercept and had not stopped when the transmissions ended, but had grown louder, as if the dying had opened a door and something on the other side was pressing through. He said the names he was reciting, the Loyalist names, were the only thing that kept the other sound at bay. He said all of this in a flat, matter-of-fact tone, the way you describe the symptoms of an illness to a physician. And then he asked me how I could stand it, how I could sit there day after day without hearing what he heard. I told him what I tell everyone. It costs me 3 days of work per operation, approximately 9 hours of listening per session, and a considerable amount of boot leather on the verification descents. These are real costs. They are measurable. They appear in my efficiency reports. He did not find this answer satisfying. Most people do not. But most people who ask that question do not also claim to hear screaming from nowhere. I filed Trevik's words under the same mental category as his breakdown. Psychological collapse, stress-induced auditory hallucination, the kind of thing that happens to people who are not built for this work. I did not think about it again. Not then. The operation that changed everything, or rather, the operation that introduced a crack into the foundation of everything I had built my professional life upon, was Vorascan. Vorascan was my 17th. A shrine world in the Dalthus Reach, Segmentum Pacificus, home to roughly 900 million souls, most of them pilgrims or permanent residents who had dedicated their lives to the maintenance of the Emperor's holy sites. Vorascan was beautiful, or so the pre-Exterminatus surveys suggested. I never saw it alive. I only saw the pict captures in the intelligence dossier, images of vast cathedral complexes stretching across mountain ranges, of processional highways wide enough to accommodate 100 pilgrims walking abreast, of golden domes and crystal spires and gardens maintained by servitors programmed with 3,000-year-old horticultural subroutines. It was, by all accounts, one of the most devout worlds in its subsector, a jewel of the ecclesiarchy, a destination for the faithful and a monument to the Emperor's glory. The intelligence dossier said chaos. Specifically, it said that a cult of Slaanesh had infiltrated the upper ecclesiarchy on Vorascan, that the senior clergy had been corrupted, that the pilgrim population was being used as a recruitment pool for demonic ritual, and that the contamination had reached a critical threshold requiring immediate action. The dossier was comprehensive. It included intercepted communications, testimony from captured cultists obtained under interrogation, picty evidence of heretical symbols and ritual sites, and a detailed assessment of the planet's strategic value, which was calculated to be insufficient to justify conventional military intervention. The recommendation was unanimous. Exterminatus. Inquisitor Croth signed the order. The method was cyclonic torpedoes, 2 of them sufficient to crack the planet's crust and ensure complete sterilization. Vorascan died in under a minute. The intercepts were brief, confused, and almost entirely ecclesiarchal in origin. Hymns, prayers, fragments of liturgy spoken by voices that did not know they were speaking their last words, a cardinal broadcasting on a high-priority ecclesiarchy channel, mid-sentence in what appeared to be a routine homily, was interrupted by the sound of the ground beneath his cathedral splitting open, and then there was nothing. On another frequency, a choir was singing. A full processional choir, 60 voices in harmony, performing what I later identified as the Canticum Imperator Ascendens, a hymn reserved for the highest feast days of the ecclesiarchal calendar. They were singing it when the torpedoes hit. The harmonics collapsed in sequence as the voices were silenced, high voices first, then the middle registers, then the basses, like an instrument being disassembled while it was still being played. It lasted 4 seconds. I have never heard anything like it since. I logged it, I cataloged it, I filed it. The verification was standard. I descended to the debris field because that is what remains of a world after cyclonic torpedoes, a field of tumbling rock fragments and cooling magma and the scattered molecular remnants of everything that had once lived there. I took my readings. I confirmed sterilization. I wrote my report. My psi-meter registered an anomaly so far above baseline that I assumed the instrument was failing. I recalibrated it 3 times in orbit and twice on the surface, and it gave me the same result every time, a needle pinned hard against the upper stop. I told myself it was the Shrine World's accumulated devotional residue, 2,000 years of pilgrim faith, concentrated into a single point of geography, suddenly released by the destruction of every cathedral that had focused it. Of course, the reading would be off the scale. The instrument was not built for shrine worlds. I noted the anomaly in my log, attributed it to environmental factors, and filed the report. The third data point. I was not yet ready to see it as such. And then, 6 months later, sitting in my chamber during a transit period between operations, with nothing to intercept and nothing to verify, and nothing to do except review archived recordings for a routine quality control audit mandated by the Ordo Excorium, I found the anomaly. I need to be precise about this, because precision is what separates a discovery from a suspicion, and a suspicion from paranoia, and paranoia from heresy. The Ordo Excorium, which monitors Exterminatus actions and ensures they are carried out within the bounds of Imperial law, such as those bounds are, requires that all archived intercepts be reviewed at 6-month intervals by the original interceptor. This is a quality control measure designed to catch transcription errors, misattributed timestamps, and other clerical failures that might compromise the integrity of the record. It is tedious work. I have been doing it for decades. I review my own recordings, correct any errors, and file a compliance report. It is the most boring part of my job, which is saying something, because large portions of my job are already boring. During the 6-month review of the Voris Khan intercepts, I noticed something that I had missed during the live operation. One of the transmissions, tagged as unknown and logged during the final seconds before total signal loss, was not a civilian or ecclesiarchy or military broadcast. It was a coded burst compressed into a fraction of a second, transmitted on a frequency that I did not recognize. During the live operation, I had registered it as noise, background static, the kind of electromagnetic detritus that any planet produces, especially one that is in the process of being torn apart by cyclonic warheads. I had tagged it unknown and moved on because there were other intercepts to log, and the world was dying, and I did not have time to analyze every fragment of static that crossed my receivers. But during the review, with time and silence and a cogitator running at full processing capacity, I pulled that burst out of the background noise and ran it through the fleet's cipher archive, a database of every encryption protocol the Ordo Hereticus has encountered. Military ciphers, ecclesiarchy ciphers, chaos cult ciphers. Everything. The burst from Voris Khan was encrypted using an inquisitorial cipher. Not a standard inquisitorial cipher. Not the kind of encryption used for routine fleet communications or intelligence reports. This was a high-level personal cipher, the type assigned to individual inquisitors for secure point-to-point communication. Someone on Voris Khan, in the final seconds before the cyclonic torpedoes reduced the planet to rubble, had sent a burst transmission using an encryption method that only an inquisitor or a member of an inquisitorial retinue would have access to. And they had sent it not on any military or civilian or ecclesiarchy frequency, but on a frequency that my standard receivers should not have been able to detect at all. The only reason I caught it was because my equipment, fine-tuned over decades of personal modification and calibration, had a slightly wider detection range than the specification called for. A standard interceptor would have missed it entirely. I decrypted the burst. This took time. The personal cipher of an inquisitor is not meant to be broken by a mid-grade auditor with a standard-issue cogitator, but I am not a standard-issue auditor. I have spent 31 years in this chair, and I have modified my equipment, and I have learned things about signals and encryption that the Schola Progenium does not teach, because the Schola Progenium has no interest in producing people like me. It took me 3 weeks of off-duty hours, working in my chamber with the door sealed and the privacy locks engaged, to break the cipher. Croth ordered it. I have proof, no identification, no context, encrypted with a cipher that only an inquisitor would possess, broadcast from a dying world in its last moments. The phrasing, "I have proof," implied something beyond the known facts. Not that Croth had ordered the action, which was a matter of record, but that there was something about the order that required proof, something that the sender believed was important enough to attempt a covert burst transmission while the planet was disintegrating around them. I sat in my chair for a long time after I decrypted that message. I did not move. I did not file a report. I did not tell anyone. I sat and I stared at 7 words on a screen, and for the first time in 31 years of professional service, I did not know what to do with a piece of data. Let me be clear about what I was thinking. I was not thinking about justice. I was not thinking about the 900 million people who had died on Voriscan. I was thinking about the cipher and what it meant for my records. If the Voriscan Exterminatus had been carried out under false pretenses, then my verification report was built on a lie. My signature, certifying the sterilization of a condemned world, was on a document that was fundamentally wrong. And that bothered me. Not the death of 900 million people, not the destruction of a shrine world and its cathedrals and its gardens and its golden domes, but the possibility that my paperwork was inaccurate. I am aware of how that sounds. I am aware that it marks me as something less than fully human, or at least something less than fully compassionate. But I have told you from the beginning what I am. I am an auditor. My purpose is accuracy. My loyalty is to the record, and the record, I was beginning to suspect, had been corrupted. I began to investigate, quietly, carefully, with the understanding that investigating an Inquisitor is the kind of activity that tends to end with the investigator being servitorized, or worse. I went back through the Voriscan intelligence dossier, the one that had provided the justification for the Exterminatus, and I examined it with the tools available to me. I could not access the raw intelligence. I did not have the clearance. But I could examine the metadata, the timestamps on the various reports and assessments that made up the dossier, and I could compare those timestamps against the fleet's navigation logs, which were part of my own records because they were used to timestamp the intercepts. The discrepancy was small, almost invisible, but it was there. 3 of the intelligence reports cited in the Voriscan dossier, the ones containing the most damning evidence of Slaneshi infiltration, the intercepted communications, the testimony from captured cultists, the picked evidence of heretical symbols, were timestamped 4 days before the Wrathful Certitude entered the Dauthus Reach. This was not, in itself, suspicious. Intelligence reports are often compiled before a fleet arrives. But those same 3 reports referenced the ship's own survey data that could only have been collected after the ship arrived in system and conducted its pre-Exterminatus orbital scans. The reports were dated before the data they referenced could possibly have existed. Someone had altered the timestamps. Someone had backdated the intelligence reports to make it appear that the evidence against Voriscan had been compiled before the fleet arrived, when in fact, it had been created, or at least finalized after the ship was already in orbit. This did not prove that the evidence was fabricated. It proved only that the administrative process had been irregular. But in the Inquisition, irregular processes are either incompetence or cover, and Inquisitor Croth, whatever else she might be, was not incompetent. I did not confront her. I am not a fool. Confronting an Inquisitor with evidence of irregularity in their operations is the same thing as accusing an Inquisitor of wrongdoing, and accusing an Inquisitor of wrongdoing without sufficient proof is heresy, and heresy is punished by death, and death is permanent. Instead, I did what I do best. I recorded, I documented. I made copies of the metadata discrepancies and stored them in a personal archive that I maintained separate from the official records, encrypted with a cipher of my own devising, hidden in a partition of my cogitator's memory core that was not indexed by the ship's main logic engine. And then I continued doing my job. I intercepted. I verified. I filed my reports. I ate my rations and played regicide with Belvane and slept through the night with my boots off, unlike Korostag, because I have never been a man who expects to be called to action at a moment's notice. But I listened more carefully now, not just to the dying worlds, to the ship, to the briefing chambers, to the whispered conversations in the corridors outside the Inquisitor's quarters, to the silence that Hellvane Croth maintained whenever Vorasgon was mentioned in her presence, a silence that might have been grief, or might have been solemnity, or might have been the careful, disciplined silence of a woman who knows that the fewer words she speaks about a particular subject, the fewer words can be used against her. The 18th operation was Kelmuth. I will tell you about Kelmuth shortly. But first I need to tell you what I found in the archives 3 months after Vorasgon, when I was reviewing intercepts from an earlier operation that I had not been assigned to. When Korostag Plein died, I inherited not only his chair and his headset, but also his archive responsibilities. Every intercept he had ever logged, every operation he had ever monitored, became part of my review mandate because there was no one else aboard qualified to maintain the continuity of the Ordo Excorium's quality control chain. This included operations that predated my service aboard the Wrathful Certitude by several years. I found another burst, same frequency, same cipher type though a different key, same structure, a compressed, encrypted message sent from a dying world in its final moments. This one was from a world called Denevorn, which had been condemned 6 years before Vorasgon for what the records described as a widespread mutation event in the planetary gene pool. The message was longer than the Vorasgon burst. 14 words. The mutation reports are fabricated. Croth is eliminating witnesses. Ordo Excorium must be informed. 14 words from a dead world, sent by someone who died knowing the truth and trying, in their last seconds of life, to make sure that someone else knew it too. And no one had heard them. No one had caught the burst. No one had decrypted it. It had sat in the archives for 6 years, filed under background noise, a ghost whispering into a void that did not care. Until me. 2 worlds, 2 coded bursts, 2 messages from dead people, saying the same thing in different words. Croth is lying. Croth is killing worlds that do not need to die. I am going to tell you what I did with this information, and you are going to judge me for it, and I accept that judgment because it is deserved. I tried to do the right thing, once, badly. The bursts I had decrypted were encrypted using inquisitorial personal ciphers, but I had only broken the encryption itself, not identified which Inquisitor's cipher had been used. The cipher archive maintained by the fleet's cryptography section contains a registry of personal cipher keys, indexed by inquisitorial ident code, and cross-referencing a decrypted message against that registry would tell me who had sent it, who these dead voices belonged to, whether they were Inquisitors themselves or members of an inquisitorial retinue. This information felt essential. If I could identify the senders, I could determine whether they were credible, whether their claims about Croth had any institutional weight, whether this was genuine evidence or the last raving delusion of 2 people who died mad. So I submitted a query, a formal cross-reference request filed through the fleet's intelligence infrastructure using my official credentials, framed as a routine cipher verification arising from my 6-month audit review. It was a legitimate request. Auditors are authorized to cross-reference intercepted signals against the cipher archive as part of the quality control process. I had done it dozens of times before, for mundane reasons to verify that a tagged transmission matched its assigned encryption category. There was nothing unusual about the query itself. What was unusual was the response, or rather the lack of response. Standard cipher archive queries return results within 2 hours. My query returned nothing, not a negative result, not an unmatched flag, nothing. The system swallowed the query and gave me silence, and within 6 hours of submitting it, my access to the cipher archive was revoked, not suspended, not flagged for review, revoked with a terse notification citing administrative restructuring of cryptographic access privileges, which is the kind of language that means nothing and everything simultaneously. Someone had seen my query, someone had recognized what I was looking for, and someone had shut the door. I understood with the cold clarity of a man who has just realized that the ice he is standing on is much thinner than he believed, that I had made a mistake. The query had touched the inquisitorial personal cipher registry, which was a restricted dataset, and touching it had generated a flag, and that flag had gone to exactly the people I should have been hiding from. I had attempted in my cautious, procedural, auditor's way to do the right thing, and the system had immediately identified me as a threat. I did not try again. I retreated to my private archive, encrypted everything with my personal cipher, and I waited. I ate my rations and played regicide with Belvane, and I waited. And the waiting was worse than the listening, because when I listen to a world die, I know the ending. But this time I did not know my own. And the reason I did not try again, the reason I will give you honestly, because there is no point in constructing a more flattering narrative at this stage, is that the system had answered my question before I had finished asking it. The revoked access, the silent query, the administrative restructuring that was not a restructuring. That was the Inquisition telling me, in its quiet, procedural way, that it knew what I was doing and that the next step would not be administrative. I had pulled on the thread had pulled back, and I discovered, with a shame that I can describe but not excuse, that I was more afraid of losing my chair and my headset and my regicide games and my double-measure recaf than I was of living with the knowledge of what Croth had done. I had built a life that functioned, you see, not a friendship or a family or a legacy, something smaller. A life that moved from day to day with a minimum of friction and a maximum of predictability. I knew the sounds of the ship, the rhythm of its engines, the particular way the hull creaked when the Geller field engaged for warp transit. I knew these things, and they were mine, and the revoked access told me exactly what the price of continued curiosity would be, and I decided, with the cold calculation of a man who has spent his career quantifying death, that the price was too high. So I stopped. And Kelmuth happened. Kelmuth was a hive world, 3 hive cities, 19 billion souls, an industrial output that contributed meaningfully to the war effort in the Korath subsector. The intelligence dossier said chaos again, this time unspecified, a general taint spreading through the underhive levels of all 3 hive cities simultaneously, which the dossier attributed to a coordinated cult network operating across the planetary surface. The recommendation was Exterminatus. Inquisitor Croth signed the order. The method was virus bombs, the old ones, the life-eater strain, deployed in a saturation pattern designed to penetrate the hive structures and reach even the deepest sub-levels. 19 billion people. I sat in my chair. I put on my headset. I listened to 19 billion people die over the course of 4 hours, which is how long it takes the life-eater virus to work its way through a triple hive complex when deployed at maximum dispersal. The sound was unlike anything I had heard before, and I have heard a great deal. A hive world does not die like an agri-world, or a shrine world, or a mining colony. A hive world dies in layers, from the outside in, the virus eating through the outer hab blocks first, and then working its way deeper, level by level, spire by spire, down through the manufactorum districts, and the commercial zones, and the residential warrens, and the underhive, deeper and deeper, like water seeping through rock. And as each layer died, the layers below could hear it coming. They could hear the silence advancing toward them, the cessation of sound that marked the boundary between the living and the dissolved, and they knew with a certainty that only the trapped can truly understand exactly how much time they had left. The intercepts from the upper hive levels lasted minutes. The intercepts from the mid-levels lasted an hour. The intercepts from the deep underhive lasted almost 4 hours, because the virus had to work its way through sealed blast doors and environmental barriers and the accumulated detritus of 10,000 years of human habitation that clogged the access tunnels like plaque in an artery. 4 hours, during which the underhive populations could hear the virus approaching, could see it on their auspex screens as a wall of biological death creeping closer with each passing minute, could feel the temperature dropping as the warm bodies of the levels above them dissolved and the residual heat dissipated. 4 hours of knowing and waiting and broadcasting pleas that no one with the power to help was listening to. Except me. I was listening. I always listen. And during those 4 hours, as I sat in my chair logging the death of the largest world I had ever been assigned to, I heard something that made my blood, which I had believed to be cold enough to withstand any temperature, go colder still. It was on a frequency I should not have been able to detect, the same frequency as the bursts from Vorascon and Denevorn, the same cipher type. But this time it was not a burst, it was an open channel, broadcasting continuously, and the voice on it was speaking in the clear, without encryption, as if the speaker no longer cared who was listening. The voice was a woman's, young, breathing hard. The words came in fragments, broken by coughing and by the sound of something heavy being dragged across metal, and by the deeper sound of the hive structure groaning around her as the virus ate through the levels above. She identified herself. Interrogator, Ordo Hereticus, attached to Kroth's retinue. The name came through broken. Melita, then static, then what sounded like Vone. She said she was in the deep underhive of Hive Primus. She said the blast doors would not hold. Then a gap, several seconds of labored breathing, and she said something that I had to replay 4 times before I could parse it through the interference. The dossier was fabricated. No cult, no taint. She coughed, a deep, ragged sound, and said a word I recognized because I had been thinking about it for months. Vorascan, then clean, then Denevorn, then clean. Then several seconds of nothing but the groan of metal and the wet, advancing sound of the virus working through the structure above her. When her voice came back, it was faster, more urgent. Fragments. Kroth. Radical faction. Dealings. Artifacts. She said something about planetary archives, records, evidence that Kroth needed destroyed. She said something about 7 years. She said the word witnesses, and then her voice broke and I could not tell if she was coughing or weeping. More static, a sound that might have been a blast door buckling. Then her voice, very quiet now, very steady, saying 2 sentences that came through clean as crystal. I am the last one. She put me here to die with the evidence. Then silence. Not the silence of a dead channel. A pause. I heard her breathing, shallow and controlled, the breathing of someone who has made a decision. I heard a sound that I catalogued, in my professional capacity, as a single-round discharge from a compact La pistol at close range. And then silence. I sat in my chair for a long time after that. I replayed the transmission. I replayed it again. I cross-referenced her fragments against the bursts from Vorascan and Denevorn, against the timestamp discrepancies I had found in the intelligence dossiers, against the revoked cipher archive access, against every piece of the puzzle that I had been accumulating in my hidden partition for months. And the picture that assembled itself from those fragments was not ambiguous. It was not open to interpretation. It was clear, and it was monstrous. Croth was not covering up past mistakes. Croth was manufacturing exterminatus actions to eliminate evidence of her dealings with a radical faction within the Ordo Hereticus. Voraskan's archives had contained something. Denevorn's population had known something. Kelmutha's records had documented something. And Croth had killed them all. 900 million and whatever Denevorn held, and now 19 billion, to ensure that the something remained unknown. Her own interrogator, Melita Vone, had been the last witness, and Croth had placed her on the surface of Kelmuth before signing the execution order, sealing her inside the weapon she had helped to aim. 3 days later, I verified Kelmuth. I descended to the surface in my environmental suit, collected my samples, took my readings, confirmed sterilization, and wrote my report. I signed it. I filed it. I certified that Kelmuthi had been rendered fully sterile in accordance with Exterminatus protocol. All 19 billion. Dead. Gone. Dissolved into chemical sludge and burned away by the firestorm that followed the viral decay. Not a cell, not a microbe, not a trace of anything that had ever lived, thought, loved, prayed, or worked in those 3 hive cities that had taken 10 millennia to build and 4 hours to destroy. And none of them had been guilty. Not a single one. Here is where you expect me to tell you that I finally acted. That Vone's death and the 19 billion innocents of Kelmutha shattered whatever was left of my compliance. That I marched to the bridge or smuggled a message to the Ordo Excorium, or at least refused to sign my next verification report. I did not do any of those things. What I did was play regicide with Comptroller Belvane that evening, and I lost. Not because he cheated this time, but because I was thinking about something else. And when he asked what was on my mind, I told him I was tired, which was true, and he accepted it, because fatigue is the most common ailment aboard a warship and requires no further explanation. I stored Vone's transmission in my private archive with the other 2 messages. I encrypted it. I hid it. And I went to sleep. And then, 3 weeks later, someone knocked on the door of my listening chamber. I had wondered during the waiting why Croth had not acted sooner. The Cipher Archive query had been flagged months earlier, before Kelmutha. The cogitator anomalies had been logged. She had known I was doing something unauthorized for longer than she had let on, and I came to understand in the quiet hours after the verification that she had been watching to see whether I would contact the Ordo Excorium and identify my own allies before she could eliminate me. Watching to see whether Kelmutha would push me into the kind of public defiance that justifies a swift execution and a sanitized incident report. I had been compliant. I had verified Kelmuth without protest. I had signed the document. And so Croth, having let me demonstrate exactly what kind of man I was when the killing came, sent her interrogator to confirm her assessment and to ensure that the compromise was sealed. It was not Inquisitor Croth. It was her interrogator, not Vone, obviously. Vone was dead, dissolved into the chemical soup that had once been Kelmutha's underhive. The new interrogator was a man I had seen aboard the ship but never spoken to, a thin, pale individual named Vescor Drune, who had the kind of face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, and the kind of eyes that looked at you the way a scalpel looks at a wound. He entered my chamber without invitation, closed the door behind him, and stood in the center of the room with his hands clasped behind his back, and said nothing for approximately 30 seconds, which is a very long time when you are sitting in a sealed room with a man who reports to an Inquisitor you suspect of mass murder. Then he spoke. He told me that the Inquisitor valued my service. He told me that my record was exemplary. He told me that the quality of my work, both as interceptor and as verifier, had been noted at the highest levels of the Ordo Hereticus. And then, with a smile that did not reach his eyes or any other part of his face, he told me that the Inquisitor had noticed some irregularities in the power consumption logs for my cogitator station. Extended processing cycles during off-duty hours. Anomalous memory partition activity. The kind of things that might indicate unauthorized data analysis. He said this was almost certainly a hardware malfunction, a degraded circuit, or a corrupted subroutine. Nothing to be concerned about, but the Inquisitor wanted to be thorough, and so a tech adept would be dispatched to inspect my equipment at my earliest convenience. I understood what he was telling me. He was telling me that Croth knew. She did not know what I had found exactly, or she would have had me killed already. But she knew that I had been doing something unauthorized with my cogitator, and she was giving me a choice. I could allow the tech adept to inspect my equipment, at which point the hidden partition would be discovered, the decrypted messages would be found, and I would be executed for unauthorized access to classified information, which is a far more administratively convenient charge than discover the Inquisitor's mass murder. Or I could purge the partition before the inspection, destroy the evidence, and continue doing my job as if nothing had happened. I looked at Vescor Droon, and Vescor Droon looked at me, and in his eyes I saw a man who was fully aware of exactly what was happening and who had chosen his side with the careful pragmatism of someone who valued his own continued existence above all other considerations. I recognized that pragmatism. It was the same pragmatism that had kept me in my chair for 31 years. "I will have the partition ready for inspection by morning," I said. Droon nodded and left, and I sat in my chamber alone, and I purged the archive. All 3 messages. The burst from Voriscan, the burst from Denavorn, the testimony of interrogator Melita Vone. I erased them, every bit, every byte, every trace, and I reformatted the partition and ran a scrubbing protocol that I had designed myself, one that overwrote the deleted data 17 times with random noise. When the tech adept arrived the next morning, the cogitator was clean. The inspection found nothing. The tech adept filed a report confirming a minor hardware degradation that had been rectified by routine maintenance. And that was that. 3 voices, crying out from 3 dead worlds, and I silenced them all. The next evening, Belvane and I played regicide as usual. But something had changed. He did not cheat, not once. He played carefully, methodically, and he let me win. And when I looked up from the board, he was studying me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something that might have been concern or might have been calculation, and he said nothing, and I said nothing, and we put the pieces away and went to our berths. He had seen Droon entering my chamber the day before. He must have. Belvane sees everything that moves through the corridors adjacent to the supply stores. He knew something had happened. He did not ask what. On a warship crewed by the Inquisition, the man who asks questions he does not need answered is the man who stops being useful. Belvane had survived this long by being useful. You might expect that this is where my story ends. The auditor who discovered the truth chose silence and lived with his cowardice. A tale about complicity, about the moral rot that infects not just the corrupt, but the compliant, about the banal machinery of evil that grinds on, not because good men do nothing, but because mediocre men decide that doing something would inconvenience them. You might expect a quiet ending. Prentoch Savarre, back in his chair, headset on, listening to the next world die, carrying his secret like a stone in his boot. Painful but not debilitating, a manageable discomfort that he has learned to walk with. That is not what happened. The 19th operation was Vostum Tertius, Gene's Stealer infestation, as I mentioned at the beginning. 4th generation, possibly 5th. Legitimately condemned. I say that without reservation. I reviewed the intelligence dossier for vox-transmissions with a scrutiny that I had never previously applied to any operation, checking every timestamp, cross-referencing every source, verifying every data point against the fleet's navigation logs and communication records. The dossier was clean. The evidence was genuine. The Genes Stealer cult was real, deeply embedded, and irrecoverably entrenched. Vox-transmissions needed to die. This was not a cover-up. This was the system working as intended, which, in a way, made it worse, because it reminded me that the system did work most of the time, and that the exceptions, the Voraskains and the Kelmuths, were aberrations, and that my silence had allowed those aberrations to be buried under the weight of all the legitimate operations that came before and after. My complicity was not a flaw in the machine, it was a feature. The machine ran on compliance, and I was the most compliant component it had. Inquisitor Croth chose virus bombs for vox-transmissions, standard deployment. The world had a population of 4 billion, and a biosphere that was mostly temperate, which made the virus particularly efficient. Temperate biospheres have dense organic matter, forests and oceans teeming with microbial life, all of it fuel for the life-eater pathogen, all of it accelerating the rate of decay and the volume of flammable gas produced as a byproduct. Vox-transmissions died in 8 minutes. The intercepts were what you would expect from a Genes Stealer world. Confused at first because the infected population did not fully understand what was happening to them, the hybrid consciousness of the brood mind interpreting the viral attack as something alien and hostile, but unable to process it through the framework of the hive mind that had governed their thoughts for 3 generations. Then afraid, as the uninfected remnant of the population recognized the virus for what it was and began broadcasting the standard emergency protocols that every world maintains and that no one maintains well enough. Then silent. 8 minutes, and then silence. I logged it. I filed it. And 2 days later, I descended to the surface for verification. Post-viral worlds carry a minimal threat assessment once the firestorm has run its course, so I went alone, as I usually do for routine operations. The surface was standard post-virus, fused glass and calcite ash, the same dead terrain I had walked 19 times before. I knew what to expect. What I did not know, what I could not have prepared for, was what I found in the ruins of the planetary capital. I was taking routine soil samples on the eastern perimeter of the ruin field when my biodetection suite registered an anomaly, not a biological signature. The planet was dead. There was nothing alive on vox-transmissions. My instruments confirmed this. The anomaly was psychic. My kit includes a psi-meter, a crude device by the standards of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, but sufficient for field work. It detects residual warp energy, the kind of psychic trace that lingers after significant warp events, demonic incursions, mass psychic trauma, and the like. It is standard equipment for verification auditors because one of the things we check for, in addition to biological survival, is warp contamination. A world that has been killed by Exterminatus but retains significant warp residue may require additional measures, a secondary strike, a Geller field purification pass, or, in extreme cases, a request for Grey Knight's intervention, which is the kind of request that ends careers. The psi-meter on vox-transmissions was not just registering residual warp energy. It was registering active warp energy. Something was happening on this dead world. Something that was generating a psychic signature strong enough to peg the needle on an instrument designed to detect the fading echoes of demonic presence. And the signature was not random. It was not the diffuse, chaotic noise of residual warp contamination. It was structured, it had a pattern, and the pattern was familiar. It sounded like screaming, Not audible screaming, not sound waves traveling through the thin, dead atmosphere. Psychic screaming, an imprint, a recording, a resonance left behind in the fabric of reality by the death of 4 billion souls in the span of 8 minutes. The warp remembers. That is one of the fundamental truths of the Imperium's understanding of the Immaterium. The warp remembers everything that happens in real space, every emotion, every thought, every death. And the more violent and sudden the death, the deeper the impression. 4 billion people dying simultaneously, their fear and pain and desperation burning through the veil between dimensions like a brand pressed into flesh that leaves a mark, a deep one. But this was not just a mark. Marks fade. Psychic residue dissipates over time, days, weeks, months, depending on the magnitude of the event. This was not fading, it was growing. The psi-meter readings were increasing as I stood there, climbing steadily, tick by tick, as if the screaming were not an echo but a living thing, feeding on something, drawing energy from somewhere, growing stronger with each passing moment. I followed the readings. I should not have. Protocol dictated that I return to the shuttle, report the anomaly to the fleet, and await further instructions. But I did not return to the shuttle. I followed the readings deeper into the ruin field, toward the center of what had been the capital, toward the point where the psychic signature was strongest. The terrain became more difficult as I moved inward. The rubble was deeper here, the fused glass thicker, the carbonized remains of structures forming ridges and valleys that I had to climb over or navigate around. My environmental suit's servos whined with the effort. My breathing was loud inside the helmet, amplified by the silence of the dead world outside. I found it in a crater. The virus and the firestorm had destroyed the physical structure, but the warp does not care about physical structures. The warp cares about meaning, about the resonance of belief concentrated in a single point over centuries. And what had stood in this crater before the virus bombs fell was a cathedral, a modest house of worship built by the original colonists, maintained for 2,000 years, a place where ordinary people had come to pray and to affirm their faith in the God-Emperor of mankind. The prayers had left a mark, 2,000 years of accumulated faith, of concentrated psychic energy directed toward a single point, had created a resonance in the warp that the virus could not destroy because it was not biological, it was spiritual. And when 4 billion people died screaming, their death energy did not dissipate evenly across the planet's surface. It was drawn to this point, to this resonance, like water flowing downhill, concentrating, intensifying, building upon the foundation of 2,000 years of prayer, until the psychic pressure became something that my instruments could barely register, and my mind could barely comprehend. I thought of Voriscan then, the shrine world, 2,000 years of faith on an entire planet, 900 million pilgrims dying with prayers on their lips and the needle pinned hard against the upper stop, while I stood on the debris field and told myself it was environmental. But Voriscan had been killed with cyclonic torpedoes. The crust had cracked. The continents had broken. The points of concentration had been scattered across 100,000 kilometers of tumbling rubble. The resonance had nowhere to gather. Here, on Vostum Tertius, the virus had killed without breaking the surface. The cathedral was destroyed, but its location remained. Its meaning remained. And the death energy of 4 billion souls had found a vessel waiting for it. I stood at the edge of the crater and I looked down, and in the fused glass at the bottom I saw something that should not have been there. A shape, an outline, like a figure pressed into the surface, arms outstretched, mouth open, frozen in a position of either supplication or agony, formed not from any physical material but from the psychic residue itself, a stain on reality that glowed with a faint, sickly light that my eyes should not have been able to see, but could somehow, through the visor of my helmet, as clear and sharp as the words on a page. And as I watched, the shape moved, not physically. It did not rise from the glass or stretch its arms or turn its head, but the glow shifted, pulsed, as if something beneath the surface were breathing. And the psi-meter, which had been climbing steadily since I entered the ruin field, suddenly spiked so hard that the needle bent against the stop, and the housing cracked, and the device went dead in my hand. Something warm ran from my left nostril, pooling against the seal of my helmet. Blood. I could taste copper at the back of my throat, and my vision narrowed, and for a moment the dead world around me pulsed like a living thing. And I heard it. Not through my headset, not through any instrument. I heard it in my skull, behind my eyes, in the space between my thoughts where the warp touches the minds of every living human, whether they know it or not. A voice. Not a voice. A sound. A frequency. The same sound I had heard through my headset 10,000 times. The sound of a world dying, but compressed, concentrated, refined into something pure and sharp and directed. It was not an echo. It was not a memory. It was alive. Something in the warp had been listening to the screams of the dying, the same screams I had spent my career recording and cataloging, and it had been feeding on them, growing, becoming. Not a demon, exactly. Not anything I had a name for. Something new, something born from the intersection of mass death and concentrated faith. Something that had been gestating in the psychic aftermath of Exterminatus actions for decades, nourished by every world I had verified, every population I had certified as dead, every soul I had logged and time-stamped and filed. Every world the fleet had killed had fed this thing. Every scream I had recorded had been a prayer, not to the Emperor, but to whatever was coalescing in the warp from the collected agony of billions. And my recordings, my archives, my meticulously maintained logs of 11,000 hours of death sounds had been the hymnal. And then, standing at the edge of that crater, with the thing in the glass pulsing below me, and the sound of dead worlds screaming inside my skull, I saw Croth's pattern from a new angle. And the angle was terrible. The radical faction, the demonic artifacts, the fabricated dossiers, the unnecessary Exterminatus orders. Voriscan, Denevorn, Kelmuther. I had assumed Croth was destroying worlds to protect her secret, to bury evidence of her corruption, to silence witnesses. That was true. But what if it was not the whole truth? What if there was a second purpose, running parallel to the first, using the cover-ups as camouflage for something far worse? The legitimate operations killed worlds that needed to die, worlds steeped in chaos or riddled with Xeno's taint. The illegitimate ones, the Voriscaeans and the Kelmuths, killed worlds that were clean, worlds whose populations were loyal, whose faith was pure, whose psychic death energy was undiluted by corruption. Clean fuel, pure anguish. Exactly the kind of offering that a thing born from the intersection of mass death and concentrated faith would hunger for. I could not prove it. I could not prove that Croth knew this thing existed, or that her radical faction served it, or that the fabricated dossiers were not just cover-ups, but menus. But the theory fit every data point I had, from the first psi-meter anomaly on Morris Vein Reach to the shape pulsing in the glass beneath my feet. And in 31 years of auditing, I have learned that a theory which fits every data point is usually not a theory. It is a preliminary finding. If my theory was correct, I did not know what Croth expected to gain. I did not know what the radical faction promised her, what power or knowledge or transcendence they offered in exchange for channeling the anguish of billions toward a thing in the Immaterium. I did not know if she understood what she was feeding, or if she was a tool of forces that had been manipulating her from the beginning. A puppet whose strings ran through the warp to hands that were not hands at all. I did not know. But what I did know, what I understood with a certainty that required no proof, and no data point and no preliminary finding, was that whether Croth was directing the pattern or merely enabling it, I had been part of it, not as a passive observer, not as a clerical footnote, as a component. My recordings, my verifications, my signatures on 19 reports, certifying 19 worlds as sterile. These were not just paperwork. They were the mechanism by which the feeding was legitimized, sanctioned, sealed with the Imperium's own stamp of approval. Without my reports, the Ordo Excorium would have flagged the operations for review. Without my intercept logs, the evidence base would have been incomplete. Without me, the machine would have stuttered, and I had kept it running smoothly, efficiently, for 31 years. I stood at the edge of that crater for a very long time. I do not know how long. Time behaves strangely when you are listening to something that exists outside of time. When I finally moved, when I finally turned my back on the shape in the glass and walked away across the dead surface toward the shuttle, the voice in my skull faded gradually, like a frequency losing signal strength, and by the time I reached the landing site and climbed aboard and sealed the hatch, it was gone, almost gone. A whisper, a murmur, a barely perceptible hum at the edge of perception, like tinnitus, like the ghost of a sound that was never quite there. I ascended to orbit. I returned to the Wrathful Certitude. I walked through the familiar corridors, past the familiar bulkheads, through the familiar hatches, to the familiar door of my listening chamber. I sat in my familiar chair. I placed my familiar headset on the console in front of me. My hands were not steady. They had not been steady since the crater, and the blood from my nose had dried in a crust inside my helmet that I had not cleaned because cleaning it would mean acknowledging what had happened. And I wrote my verification report for Warhammer 40K. Prentoch Savarre, Verification Auditor, 1st grade, hereby certifies that planetary body designation Warhammer 40K has been rendered fully sterile in accordance with Exterminatus protocol and presents no further biological, psychic, or strategic threat to the Imperium of man. I lied. For the first time in 31 years, I lied in an official report. I omitted the psi-meter readings. I omitted the shape in the crater. I omitted the voice. I wrote that the psychic residue levels were within expected parameters for a world of Warhammer 40K's population density, and that no further action was required. I signed the report. I filed it. And I sealed my chamber and sat in the dark and did not move for a very long time. You want to know why I lied? The answer is simple. Reporting the truth would have required me to explain not only what I found in the crater, but how I knew what it meant. The timestamp discrepancies, the bursts from dead worlds, Vaughn's broken testimony, the revoked cipher archive access, the pattern connecting Croth's fabricated dossiers to the thing growing in the warp. All of it. I would have had to explain that I had been investigating an Inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus for months, that I had been hoarding evidence in a hidden partition, that I had cracked inquisitorial personal ciphers in my off-duty hours, and that the sum total of my investigation pointed to a conspiracy so vast and so embedded in the operations of this fleet that exposing it would require dismantling the very mechanism by which the Imperium enforces its most extreme sanction. They would not have thanked me. They would not have promoted me. They would have executed me for unauthorized access to classified information, and then they would have executed me again, posthumously, for heresy. and then they would have erased my name from every record I had ever signed, and Croth would have continued, and the thing in the warp would have continued, and the screaming would have continued, and nothing at all would have changed. So I lied, because lying kept me alive, and alive is the only state in which a man can still choose, and I have not yet decided what I am going to choose. Here is the last thing I will tell you. The next operation is already scheduled. Inquisitor Croth has signed the order. The virus bombs are being loaded into the torpedo tubes. I have calibrated my Vox receivers. I have cleaned my environmental suit. I have reserved my berth on the verification shuttle. And somewhere in the Immaterium, something is waiting, the way a congregation waits for the hymn to begin. I will sit in my chair. I will put on my headset. I will listen. And for the first time in 31 years, I will hear what Trevik heard. The sound behind the sound. The thing that does not stop when the signals die. It has always been there. I simply was not listening for it. I am Prentoch Savarre, Verification Auditor, 1st grade. And the most horrific role on an Exterminatus fleet is not the one who gives the order, or the one who fires the weapons, or even the one who listens to the screaming. It is the one who goes down after, walks the ashes, and tells the Imperium that everything is fine. Everything is not fine. But the paperwork is in order.